3. This story is told by a villager who was only 8 years old at the time of the events. One afternoon he was sitting at home doing his homework. His parents were not at home. Suddenly he noticed some movement near his bed, turned around and saw a strange thing. From behind the headboard of the bed, one after another, 3 little old men in ancient clothes came out and walked past him across the room. All 3 were no more than a meter tall, like dwarfs, and all 3 were bent and hunched over. With difficulty they dragged themselves past the boy, who was dumbfounded by such visitors, and looked at him curiously, but they had no thought of stopping, so they walked across the room, constantly turning their old wrinkled faces in his direction. So they crossed the room diagonally, and by the time they reached the opposite corner of the room from the boy, their necks had turned almost 180 degrees, so that their faces were still in the boy's field of vision. There all 3 disappeared, literally sealing themselves into the wall. The boy was greatly frightened by this sight and ran out of the house into the street. A day later, an old neighbor's house burned to the ground, which was just on the other side of the storyteller's house, where these dwarfs had come from. He himself later believed that he had seen the guardian spirits of the house, who had to leave their home and move to another place because of the impending catastrophe. Story 2. The Woman in White. A crowd of men came to a wide meadow for haymaking. It was a hot July day. The sky was without a single cloud. The lake in the center glistened blue, and lush grass was green all around. The men were sitting at the edge of the forest, sharpening scythes, smoking, distributing plots for mowing, talking about this and that, in general, preparing to start work. Suddenly, they saw a woman in white clothes walking along the path that led to the clearing from the opposite edge of the forest. At first, they thought it was someone's wife or daughter, and began to watch anxiously. It was 10 kilometers to the village, and they would not send a man to the clearing without a reason in the middle of the day, in case there was some trouble. But the closer the woman came, the more clearly the men realized that she did not resemble any of the village women they knew, and her movements were sharp, quick, as if in fast forward. She was tall, heavy, in a white dress, with a white shawl on her head, and a large braid, the tool, not the hair, thrown over her shoulder. She looked swarthy, but I couldn't make out any facial features. Anyway, the woman walked over to the tall grass, took the scythe off her shoulders, swung it, and started mowing. The grass flew in all directions. The woman carried forward with sprinting speed, leaving behind her a perfectly mowed strip. It is worth noting that in the olden days, the ability of men to quickly and efficiently cut grass was valued very highly. Often organized whole competitions in this discipline with valuable prizes. That is, in the eyes of men, it looked as if they came to the gym and started warming up. And then some left woman came and started lifting 100-kilogram weights in front of their eyes. All in all, the men were embarrassed, and at the same time felt their egos hurt. The bravest decided that it was not worth sitting still, but to approach the strange woman and demand an explanation of what she had forgotten in their legitimate clearing. In general, he confidently moved to where the woman continued to organize herbal genocide, and the rest began to scratch their heads and see what would come out of this scheme. When the man began to approach the lady, they scratched the back of their heads more often. Earlier, the figure of the strange mower woman was nothing to compare with against the background of distant objects like a lake or a forest. But the closer the man came to her, the clearer it became that the woman was not just big, but something abnormally tall, more than 2.5 meters tall. Actually, quite quickly, it came to the man himself. He first stopped, looking at the giant woman, who did not even look in his direction and passionately engaged in her work, and then felt a chill down his spine and ran back to his place. All in all, the working day did not go well for the men, and they decided to leave the clearing quietly and return to the village along the edge of the forest. As they left, they often looked over their shoulders and still saw a tall figure in white, waving vigorously with a scythe, and a long strip of freshly cut green grass that stretched behind her. When the men decided to return to the clearing a few days later, feeling an understandable trepidation, They found the same tall and lush grass that had greeted them a few days before. There was no sign that the scythe blade had ever touched it this summer. It remained unclear what they had seen and what it meant. They hadn't broken any customs, hadn't been drinking, hadn't made any noise, and had treated the spirits of the land upon arrival, so there was no reason to displease the local invisibles, though it was understandable that the behavior of paranormal beings didn't have to fit into human logic. The haying began as usual, and there were no more strange events this summer. Story 3. Housewarming Party. It used to be believed that building houses close to major roads and other transport routes was not a great idea, because not only people but also other entities might travel along these routes. If someone's house was close to the road, these entities might drop by. Obviously, no one would build a house 2 meters away from a highway, but the interesting part is that if there was once a road on that spot that later disappeared for various reasons, it does not mean that the supernatural stopped wandering along it. Those who build a house on that spot later might not even know that they are living on an ancient path. I remember such a story, though without many details. It is not quite like other road stories, but here it is. The essence was that a family built a house right where a wide road leading through the taiga used to be. With the advancement of technology, transportation routes shifted, the road overgrew, and when the village expanded, new residential quarters began to be built closer to that zone. The family finally moved into the house and threw a grand housewarming party with songs, dances, and more. As night fell and most guests went home, leaving only the most persistent drinkers, strange things began to happen. At some point, there were clearly more people at the party than there should have been, and most of the new guests had severe physical deformities. One had a single eye, another had a horn protruding from his forehead, a third was a naked woman with 3 arms, and so on. The real guests and hosts, who remained in the house by then, were not only very drunk but, as they realized later, under some sort of spell. They perceived everything as if in a dream or vision, and continued to celebrate with the grotesque figures. The intruders soon got out of hand. They began breaking dishes, destroying furniture, and urinating in the water barrel. The climax was when they brought in handfuls of dirt from outside and scattered it everywhere, from the remaining cups to the shoes by the door. In the morning, the residents woke up with a terrible hangover. Initially, each of them thought the night's events were just a hallucination or a dream, but the wrecked house and the gray soil in the vessels and shoes convinced them that something really went wrong the previous night. The family tried to live in the house for a while, despite being warned that it was built on old trade routes. However, after a year of enduring constant strange occurrences like shadows in the evenings, voices from nowhere, moving objects, and other regular poltergeist activities, they finally moved out, and the house was abandoned. Story 4. The Gathering of Evil Spirits. There is a concept in folklore known as the gathering of evil spirits. It is believed that from time to time, local abesi gather in a secluded spot, unvisited by humans, to hold a meeting about their upcoming plans. There are stories of random human witnesses stumbling upon such gatherings. Here is a typical story. In the early 20th century, a traveler was returning on horseback to his native village one summer evening. As it was getting late, he decided to spend the night in an old abandoned hut on a clearing known as an alas along his route. He was familiar with the area and had stayed in this hut many times before during his travels, so he felt no apprehension. He arrived at the place, let his horse graze on the clearing, and headed towards the hut. Although the hut appeared as uninhabited as usual, no light from the stove's fire in the windows, no sparks from the chimney, the traveler heard voices inside, engaged in a heated discussion, constantly interrupting each other. At the same time, he detected a foul odor emanating from the hut. Feeling uneasy, he hesitated to enter and instead approached the window, pressing himself against the wall to cautiously peek inside. It was a wise move. Inside, the hut was teeming with strange entities. Some looked like intangible black shadows, while others were material, but their appearances seemed to blur, preventing clear recognition of any details. All these beings were focused on the center of the hut, where a 2-meter-tall figure stood with its back to the window, and thus to our hero. Ignoring the continuous hubbub in the hut, this figure was booming out a list of names. It was clear that this tall speaker was in charge. Suddenly, the traveler, whose breath was taken away by the sight, heard the speaker mention the name of a person he knew, a resident of a nearby village who was bedridden with tuberculosis. Immediately, the beings in the hut surrounded the speaker and began clamoring with renewed vigor. He can't be touched. This one has too strong a guardian spirit. We've been trying to get him for years. It's pointless. It's not time yet." The speaker hesitated and slightly turned, changing his stance, and the traveler noticed that he was holding a piece of paper and reading the list from it. Heeding the protests of the gathering, the speaker silently made a mark on the list and continued to announce the names of people who, as the traveler realized by this point, were chosen as the next victims of the Abasi. The traveler didn't listen further, as some of the shadows closest to the window began showing clear signs of suspicion and restlessly looking around. The traveler quietly stepped away from the window and, once at a safe distance, ran to his horse to leave the site of the eerie symposium as quickly as possible. As a postscript to the story, it is noted that the traveler's acquaintance, whose invulnerability the Abasi had complained about, lived for many more years to a ripe old age despite his illness and frailty.